So, with the formal part of it, welcome to SaaSy Sales Leadership and WNS Denali Insider's Look at the Procurement Function. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Cameron, CEO of SaaSy Sales, and I'm really grateful to be joined by Greg Anderson of WNS Denali, who has over 2 decades of strategic sourcing experience that we're going to be drawing on to help you understand the role of procurement and how you can get better outcomes for both sides when you engage in a formal sourcing process. So, Greg, thanks for being with us. And to give everyone some context, could you start by just providing us with a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what WNS Denali does and who you serve?
Sure, Matt. Thanks. First, thanks for being here, and thanks for everybody who's attending this today. It's great to have this opportunity. So WNS Denali, outcome-driven companies partner with WNS Denali to operationalize their procurement function and improve financial performance and efficiency. So we provide advisory services on strategy and putting together a target operating model, for instance. We provide managed services where we actually help them run certain parts of their procurement operations. And we also provide some digital tools and services around those tools to help our clients build what we call stronger procurement ecosystems. And that enables them to make a bigger strategic impact on their business outcomes. So who do we call on? We call on Fortune 1000 companies globally and across multiple industries. So high tech, CPG, retail, manufacturing, telecom, financial services, life sciences, travel, insurance, a lot of different kind of companies, because they all have one thing in common. They all have indirect spend, and that is generally where we focus our efforts, most of our efforts. So our clients are familiar enterprise logos, and a good number of them are based in Silicon Valley. So we've got a nice presence on the West Coast with some of the leading companies out there. And so I know that's of interest to your audience.
100%. Well, thanks for that. So look, WNS Denali really covers the spectrum, and we're going to talk about the different roles, responsibilities, and the setup of procurement function depending on size. Now, I know some of you have team members that really should be here or want to be here, so I will let you know that we are recording the session and we'll make it available. My recommendation, though, is that you're with us to the end because you want to figure out what's relevant and where to point people as we get through this. So, why don't we start at the top and make sure that we're all on the same page, Greg? Can you kick it off for us by explaining or defining for us what the role of the procurement function actually is?
Yeah, sure. So I see it in 4 parts, right? There's a strategic role, and that's to really help the organization achieve their business outcomes. That could be growth, that could be new product launches, that could be an initiative to move their IT from on-premise to the cloud, right? It's really doing that though through thoughtful supply strategies. So they're helping to come up with the right suppliers to help execute on those, internal stakeholder strategies to drive those business outcomes. Second purpose and role of procurement, I would say, is financial, right? And that's about getting the best value for the organization's money. Certainly, that's a big part of what they do. The third focus is risk. And that's to manage supply risk, on the supply side. That could be insolvency, that could be, delivery and quality issues to make sure that the suppliers they select are able to serve them and don't, present a risk to their supply chain. And the last part, which is becoming more and more important, and I think it's appropriate because today is Earth Day. Happy Earth Day, Matt. Corporate responsibility and sustainability. They're there to help move the organization toward a more diverse supply base. And that is really often a supply base that's targeted to reflect their customer base, especially for business to consumer companies. It's also this corporate responsibility, sustainability also includes responsible and ethical sourcing to make sure they're getting the goods and services that they acquire from legitimate suppliers, and there's no slave labor and things of that nature. The third is to move towards sustainable products. And then last is a lot of companies are moving towards carbon neutrality, and they play a big part in that. And those are all supply chain driven and supply side driven initiatives.
It's really interesting because for many folks on the call, and perhaps me in my younger days, I always just thought procurement was there to take another bite of the cherry when it comes to discount. right? And so there was a lot packed into what you just said. So I think we need to unpack a little bit about that. But some things that I want people to be thinking about is this consideration about diversity, for example, supply chain surety. And for those of you in SaaS, say, and I know many folks here will be selling software in SaaS, you're like, well, does that apply to me? Well, it does if you're a Series A company selling a mission critical piece of infrastructure. So for example, an accounts receivable system or anything in the heart of the business, procurement are going to be wondering about the risk of your survival. Right, Greg?
Right on. That's absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So I've dealt with folks who kind of appear just at the end when the legal terms come out, right? And that's the first time I've seen them, and they do seem to be focused on risk and cost. And equally, I've also collaborated with procurement professionals in solution design, which is much more fun, which might surprise a few people listening. So can you just help us understand how the function of procurement can be structured depending on the company's size? Because it is different, right?
It is, yes. And it depends on size and maturity. But generally speaking, if we just say, if we look at an archetype here, it's there's a chief procurement officer, right? A CPO, might be a chief supply chain officer in some industries, but somebody is there at the top, and it's more and more a C-level function. And then they have an organization, and that organization, the more mature ones will have a category management function. And those people are experts in particular categories of spend, generally ones that the company purchases a lot of, right? So you see IT category managers, professional services category managers, right? And so on. And then those folks are coming up with portfolios of sourcing projects. They're working with the business stakeholders. So there's a team in the source to contract and supplier management, and it's running the sourcing projects, helping to select and then put the selected suppliers under contract. Right. And then once they're under contract, they're also there to manage and monitor their relationships. And that's something I think we'll cover a little bit later, but what happens after the sale. And then beyond that, there's procure to pay operations. And that's really when somebody goes to buy something, right, you want to guide them towards that contract that you've negotiated with the preferred supplier and make sure that experience is pretty streamlined and low touch. If you're going to touch anything down there from a procurement point of view, you better add value. Otherwise, it's a great place to put automation in, and more companies have put that automation in to make that pretty seamless on the buying side, right? So a PO goes out, it gets flipped into an invoice, the goods get received, there's a three-way match, and they get paid. So that's the four functions that sort of run end-to-end procurement. And then there's supporting functions too. So there's very often a center of excellence that supports those teams. They might have an analytics function, right, that's running analytics on spend and other operational metrics that they're trying to measure. They may provide market intelligence services, right, to the folks that are doing the work day to day. They're out researching suppliers. They also set up best practices and knowledge sharing across the company. And then an emerging function that we're seeing is an enabling technologies team. And sometimes that's mixed in with that center of excellence, but more and more we're seeing it stand alone, that there's a team that's there to set up and operate and enhance the technology that they're using. So they want to apply and drive adoption of the procurement technologies all the way across that life cycle. So all the way from sourcing to contracting through procure to pay.
So this is really interesting. And for those enterprise and complex sales professionals who think about buying roles, I've rarely seen anybody put a box for procurement in the buying role that's anything other than, influencer, right? And what I'm hearing you say is based on these centers of excellence and these category managers that have specialist skill sets, they should for sure often be considered as evaluators and decision makers, right? I think the assumption that's commonly made is that procurement might have something to do with decision, but in terms of core evaluation of, to your earlier point, actually filtering who gets a seat at the table to be considered, to even get in the consideration set, that early. So why don't we talk about that? Like how does procurement align to the rest of the business? And maybe you could talk us through kind of where procurements come from and what it looks like today in that context.
Yeah, sure. It's a strategic function. So I'd start by saying that they are involved in the decision because they're looked on more and more to be an expert, especially in the categories that they're responsible for. So I would answer your question by saying there's a shift that's underway right now in procurement, and it's been going on for the last 2 decades, where procurement's moving from that back office cost cutter that maybe the impression is, that's the old impression, right, to really being a strategic enabler of business outcomes. And this is particularly close to me because that's what we do with our clients. We help them make that shift, that transformation from really an operational task focus to a higher value strategic activity. So if you think about a pyramid, right, and that pyramid is divided into 3 categories, 3 sections, if you will: strategic work, execution work, running RFPs, right, and transactional work like pushing POs and PRs around. That generally breaks down to 20% strategic, and the balance of the operational work, the execution and transactional stuff, is like 80% of people's time. And what's the realization is wow, we need to have a more strategic procurement function, because a lot of the innovation we bring into the company comes from suppliers, right? So there's a push to move more of that work to the strategic part. So what we help companies do is flip the pyramid, right? So we say, look, we can help you take those strategic folks and have them spend 80% of their time on the strategic activities, working with stakeholders, understanding business requirements, really working with them to come up with good solutions, supply solutions. And then the other part of their time, they're going to have a little bit of time in the operational task, but that's very often out-tasked to somebody who can do it much more efficiently and effectively, so that the retained folks that are there are really playing a much more strategic role in the business, and they're not just this back office function that some people have this impression they are. So that's what's happening, and a lot of the low-value transactional stuff, as I mentioned, is being automated through technology. So every company you meet is somewhere in that transformation journey from really operationally focused to more strategically focused. And that varies from organization to organization. But what your listeners should know is this: most enterprises, if not all, are developing the capabilities and they're creating the organizational capacity and the operating model required to solve the biggest strategic problems for the business and impact the business outcomes. So this shift is happening, and you'll see procurement becoming more and more strategic as time goes on.
This is really important stuff, right? I have never seen an account penetration plan or an account development plan around ABM where they include the procurement category manager head in that pre-opportunity. Never seen it. Mm-hmm. And what I'm hearing you say is that's a big mistake, because if they're out there doing that strategic thinking about what the business needs, you want to be influencing that thinking, being useful to them, providing them insight before a formal project is stood up. And nobody does that, from what I can tell. Is that a fair observation?
It is, right. Everybody, would say, okay, the CIO has all the IT knowledge and strategy, and procurement just helps them run a process, right? It's not like that. The CIO can't know everything, can't be up to date with every supplier trend and technology trend that's happening in the market. So you rely on the procurement people to also have that knowledge and be aware of it. So you'll see procurement people going to shows to learn about the categories and what's happening with those categories, so that they're really, as I mentioned before, an internal expert to help the business stakeholder functional leads, pick the right supply strategies.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think it would be very helpful to make this tangible. So understanding how procurement's engaged when a business stakeholder has a problem, right? Sort of before the solution is defined and we're looking for vendors. So maybe if we take an example where, say, a chief financial officer wants to reduce the time it takes to get paid, and for you finance nerds out there, to reduce debtor days, right? And let's say so they're the executive sponsor. The project lead might be the head of accounts receivable, the responsible party, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens next in terms of how procurement might get brought into this process?
Yeah, so, what would typically happen is if there's a category manager responsible for software, right? This would be a SaaS product we're dealing with here. They're going to meet with that person, that business lead on the accounts receivable side, and say, hey, let's do a comprehensive requirements analysis to really understand what you're doing. And more, and I just recorded a session on this. We're going to play next month at a conference, but the idea of design thinking is making its way into procurement. So the category manager can meet with them and really say, go in and approach it with empathy, understand what their pain points are and what the biggest challenges they're trying to overcome are, and really listen actively and understand what they're trying to accomplish and what's getting in the way of them accomplishing that. So you can really help to understand what kind of solution they really need and guide them toward a solution. And add to that the category manager is going to bring market knowledge. Who are the suppliers? What are the solutions that are out there? They're talking to Gartner, right? If they have a subscription to Gartner, other people like that, to understand what are the emerging technologies, right? Not just the established ones that are always up in the upper right corner, but the new ones maybe we should be looking at, right? And the trends that are happening in those. And then they can talk to them about, talk to the end user, the accounts receivable person, about supplier innovation opportunities. Maybe we should invite a supplier in to kind of look at this problem, or a couple suppliers, and come up with some prototypes of solutions for us, right, together. So it's a really collaborative effort when it works well, that they're working there. And a lot of times you'll go and they're like, we need to buy this software. I heard it's really good. Well, let's talk about what your problem is that you're trying to solve and what your pain points are before we select the solution, right? Because many people have jumped the gun. Everybody wants to solve problems quickly, but more and more it's a discussion about what are you trying to solve for. So it's an ideation that's going on between the end user, the end consumer of whatever they're going to buy, in this case, an accounts receivable SaaS product, and the category team, right? The category manager.
There are a couple of things I want to pull out there for people. So folks listening, are your marketing people building campaigns around category managers? Are they building relationships with them? And you said, Greg, they're going to Gartner, they're going to conferences, they're self-educating. So all these content marketers out there that are talking to the functional buyer, right? I think they're ignoring a really critical stakeholder here. So that's number one, that I pulled out of that. And the second thing is getting in early and helping them ideate around how they might solve a problem. And so, it makes me think about a multinational who I won't name, but they have computer vision technology. So, video camera that can be applied to counting things, observing the state of things. So the same vision technology, for example, can count how many people are in an elevator. And in COVID times, you don't want more, say, than 4 people in. And it'll say to the elevator, you got to skip the next 2 floors and go to ground because we're full. That same tech can be applied to counting how many bananas there are at a supermarket, right? Time to refill the stock. That vendor has such a trusted advisor relationship with these large chains and these large organizations that they're in the ideation stage workshopping, how might we solve this problem? And can you imagine what it looks like when they go to the formal tendering process and write the requirements, right? They've been in there since the start. So, specific take-homes for folks. Number one, if you're selling a product where you can prototype, if it's more of a physical thing, or if you're building bespoke software and whatnot, how do you get in there early? How do you align yourself with these people? And number two, what are your marketing folks doing to educate, inform, and build relationships with these critically important category managers?
I'd add to that, as you think, right, the buyer's journey, right? And so many people now, it's talked about how far down into the funnel marketing owns now, right? So it used to be just the very top, get them in there, sales will take it from here. You've got to educate them. Most people are not going to call you until they've done all their research, and you've got to make sure there's good content, and whether that's video or that's in brochures, right? We have to do this ourselves to make sure people get to know who we are and what we do and learn about us. So when they come to us, they're ready and they know a lot already, and they want to hear about that story in a little bit more detail. So it's really important to make sure you're marketing to the right people, right? When you're putting that content out there, the buyer's journey, have some out there for the procurement folks as well.
100%. All right, now we like to get super tactical here, so why don't we kick off with some questions? A couple are coming through already. Thanks, CJ, see yours, but I'm going to jump to this one here first. So, yeah, this is great. For salespeople would ask this. So, Greg, what should salespeople avoid in order to not cause headaches for procurement and to remove some of the friction? Because it's a good question, because most sales folks I know dread hitting procurement when perhaps it's an opportunity. How should we think about that?
Yeah, I think you should think about it in terms of, respect the process. They have a role in this process, and it's pretty well clearly laid out how communication should flow, right? So, let's say come to us, right? Don't call the stakeholder. Don't try to do an end around. And I'd say deviate from that at your own peril, because they are trying to put some control in the process. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't talk to people sometimes, but make sure you're being respectful and saying, hey, I have an idea. I'd really like to share it. I don't see a way to do that. Maybe the way this RFP is structured or the way the communication's set up. Is there a way I could potentially talk to you one-on-one, or get a bit of an audience so we can explain a differentiated capability that we have that I think you might be overlooking that might be valuable to you, right? So treat it with respect, the process with respect, but also ask, right? If you don't ask, you'll never know, but it never hurts to ask.
100% actually leads quite nicely into CJ's question. Before I get to that, though, it makes me think, for those of you out there thinking about your deal strategy, what Greg just said is basically a flanking strategy, right? You're not trying to compete head to head on the terms that have been laid out, but you're like, well, we think you should be thinking about this differently, which is changing the criteria from A to B, or expanding the criteria, some things that they haven't thought about. And, there's some discussion around the risks around doing that. But in order to do that, you have to have a sufficiently good relationship with someone on the other side that they'll let you have that conversation, which I think is why it points to your, goes back to your earlier point, Greg, about establishing early relationships with these people. I mean, if they don't know you from Adam, they're not going to want to deviate from the process. But if you've been supporting them, helping them, advising them, guiding them, and you have Gartner-like credibility, then they're much more inclined to listen to you, right?
Right, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So CJ asked a good one. So paper. He says, do you have any advice for SaaS vendors like him where you're trying to navigate technology suppliers, assuming that there's a business demand, that require the SaaS company paper to be signed for the solution? Because a lot of large orgs push back and say, no, on our paper, right? This is the way we're doing it. But SaaS companies often have purpose-built agreements for their software. So I think the question is, what do you do about that? Like, how do you articulate the difference? When do you need to move more in their direction? How do you think about that?
I think it's, so at the end of the day, I like to think that most people are reasonable and logical. There's exceptions, but right, if you say, look, the agreement that you've sent to me really doesn't contemplate or address a lot of the kind of terms that would be used for a SaaS software, right? This is more of an on-prem type of an agreement. And a lot of this language isn't going to be applicable. Could you take a look at our agreement or have your legal team take a look at our agreement to see if that's something that we could use, right? At the end of the day, we all will, on the sales side, and I'm on the sales side, let's remember that. We're all going to ultimately, work on their paper if that's the only way it's going to get the deal done. I realize that with the SaaS agreements, you try to do it much faster and it's a more straightforward agreement. But I think you really have to just to say, if we want this business with this particular enterprise and they won't budge on their paper, that's a decision you have to make as a business to say, will we go through that process? And maybe if it's too small of a deal size or transaction size, it's not worth it for you. But that's a decision businesses have to make, and everybody has to adjust their model and policies around that.
I think that's really good advice. I mean, I was early in SaaS, Salesforce in 2005, and we'd get software type agreements that had silly things like, code escrow. Well, even if we did that, you couldn't stand up the code because it's built in a multi-tenant environment, and you don't have that. So, and there are many examples of things like that. So I think that's good advice.
Exactly. Yeah, we had one once. I'll just give you another story. We had one where it was, there was a concern about personal information, and we said this is really contemplating sort of a consumer-driven software. This isn't what we're offering. There's going to be an email address in there, and there's going to be a name, right? Maybe a phone number. That's really not the personal information you're trying to protect. And that in that case, that company was willing to adjust that particular clause in the policy. So again, people are generally logical and reasonable, and the agreement has to fit the purchase.
Yeah. I mean, there's a bigger conversation around contract negotiation, whatever else. But the other day, I was dealing with a really great procurement professional, and it was actually about timing of payments and cancellation clauses, and seek first to understand every time, because his concern was, look, we won't have even started, and you're asking for half the amount up front, even if we cancel a few days before, but you've done no work. And actually, my response was, actually, that's not my concern. My concern is that if I've booked your work, I can't book anyone else during that month. That's what the compensation's for. You know what I mean? It's really making sure we understand each other.
Yeah, that's what negotiation's about, right? What is important to you? What is important to us? And why? Ask why.
Why?
Oh, now I get it, right? And it saves you a lot of back and forth if you get that on the table right away.
Yeah. Now, I've got a couple of questions from Tom here, really good ones I know you'll like. I might try and combine them for you. So to start with, the shift from 20% to 80% being more strategic, does that require the organization to change personnel? Because it sounds like a major shift in process and knowledge. And then I'll give you a follow-up question on that.
Yeah, so it does sometimes, right? So if you look at what that strategic activity becomes, it becomes, I need people who can face up with a business stakeholder, right? Maybe a CMO or a CIO, right? And have a conversation, establish credibility, right? Establish trust. So what's trust? Trust is credibility times intimacy divided by risk, right? So when you go to them, you have to have A game on, and there's some really great people that really understand categories well, but if they're so introverted that they can't go have that stakeholder discussion, right? You may have to think, where do I use that person? Because they're not the right person to act as a diplomat for procurement to go talk to the CIO, right? So there is a look at skill sets, and a lot of some of what we do, right, is not just take away the drudgery work, if you will, and the tasks that have to get done. So it leaves them to do strategic, gives them the capacity. We also provide training. So we have enablement programs that we run with customers to help them be a better category manager. And that involves, how do you talk to a stakeholder? How do you work with them and understand their business outcomes? And how do you work with them to develop a good portfolio of projects that are valuable to the business and valuable to them, so that you're really helping them drive the outcomes, right? I'm going to keep saying business outcomes because that's what this is ultimately all about. So yes, sometimes you have to change the people to do that. But you should also ask, are we getting the full potential out of our people today, right? And before you do that, right, where can I use that person, or who's best suited for this? But yeah, it takes some charming, some charm skills and soft skills that maybe people didn't have to have before, when they just took an order and said, oh, they need to go buy this, I'm going to go do this transaction, or they already negotiated the contract, I'll go write it. Right? That's a different person than the person that's going to go work out a solution in an interactive and iterative way with a business stakeholder.
It's really interesting, because I think enterprise salespeople always think about who their champion and their activist or advocate or challenger profile of buyer is going to be, who has the internal horsepower to make change. And that's part of what I'm hearing you say, right? They need to be able to internally influence and have the executive acumen to be credible within their organization, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So Tom had a follow-up because he wants a bonus question. Thinking about the sort of maturity adoption curve of this new model, in your experience, What percentage of organizations are at the sort of 80% strategic, right? And does this number vary by industry size or business sector?
Yeah, I don't know that I'll answer the last part first. I don't know if it's by size or business sector. Generally, larger organizations are more mature, right? And it really depends on how important procurement and supply chain is to their sort of the core operation of their business, right? If it's a very, margins are tight, you're going to see a really strong procurement organization. If it's a business that's, we work with some companies, all they're focused on is growth, right? Let's get this thing growing and going, and we'll put some basic infrastructure in place to make sure there's purchasing. Then they come to the realization like, we're big enough now. We need to get serious about this part of our operations, right? So they'll put that in place. They'll start moving toward that. I would say it's really tough to gauge. I'd say it's about half and half. Where people have moved to the more strategic model, but it's a shift in operating model, and there's companies that are on that journey. And the other thing I would point out is some people say, we're going to get there over 5 years. Some are saying, I want to get there in a year, right? And that's a whole different plan to do that, right? So when we work with them, it's like, oh, you're trying to transform. We understand and appreciate your vision. Now, how fast do you want to get there? How far, how fast, right? And so that's something that has to be taken into account as well. But I think it's happening there. I think, and you said it about IT used to be sort of the same kind of back office function. And now it's a very prominent role in the businesses, given all things digital. And that's where procurement is going, right? And the strongest companies are pushing it faster than maybe some of the laggards.
Fantastic answer, really helpful. So Siobhan has a good question, clearly a sales-focused question. What should sales professionals be thinking about in terms of aligning with and supporting a procurement counterpart? So the subtext to me is Siobhan's worked with procurement and had a lot of friction at some point, and it's like, how do I stop that from happening? So how do you become useful and a partner to procurement during their processes?
Yes, I think the first thing is to remember that procurement's trying to help their business stakeholder find the best solution, right? And that's why I hope your audience walks away today is they're really there to help them find a good solution, right? Well, at the same time, managing cost and risk, right? You can't just say, well, we're willing to pay anything for the right solution. That's not going to happen, right? So there's always constraints. So understand what their role is and what they're trying to do, and then try to understand the why behind the solution. And this is the business outcomes. I'm going to say it again. Somebody's going to count this and tell me how many times they said this in this thing, and I don't care. It's about business outcomes, right? So what are they trying to do? And then help the procurement person by articulating how your solution will support the achievement of those outcomes. Matt, you do teardowns on Tractor Supply and other businesses. I know you do it. And you look for these things in their earnings calls and their reports, and you tie your solution to that, right? That is the smartest thing you can do, because if you really understand what they're trying to do and keep asking questions, then you can get better alignment with them, because they're like, okay, I get it. This person now sees what we're trying to accomplish, and they're really trying to position their solution to help us do that and articulate why their solution's better than others at doing that. And then the last thing I'd say is offer your assistance. I once was selling to a major oil and gas company, and we got to the point where the deal was pretty close, and it was a really good deal. And the guy said, hey, can you help me calculate what this is going to contribute to us in terms of synergy savings, because they were merging two companies. And I'm like, I'm glad to. Thank you. Yep. Yes, I have written RFPs for companies before, right? Because they wanted to work with us, and they said, please help us write the RFP, right? So offer your assistance. They may not always take you up on it, but offer your assistance in demonstrating the ROI and benefits of your solution, and help them with their analysis to be able, because when they go present a solution, they can say, look, this solution I think will help us achieve the business outcomes better than any other. And we may have to pay a bit more for it, but it just seems to fit your need, Mr. or Mrs. Stakeholder, much better than any of the other ones, right? So you can help them do their job, is offer that assistance, right? And look, you're going to get some arm's length sometimes, But the enlightened procurement folks will say, listen, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. We're really trying to solve for a good solution, the best solution here. And they may be open to that.
It's really interesting. It brings up something for me. It might come from a place of pain, but everyone used to say to me when I was young, look, if you didn't help write the RFP, then you got no business responding to it. So I disagree. Obviously, it really depends where it comes from. But sometimes there'll be an account that's very large and you could be selling into any one of a number of divisions. But in this specific instance, you can see an RFP that clearly has landmines written for you that would only have been placed there by a competitor who has a pre-existing relationship with the customer, and maybe even know they have a pre-existing relationship. My thinking about that, and what I've done in the past, love your perspective on this, is I've actually called them on it and say, hey, listen, I want to support you in this. It feels like we're not the best solution for you, but if it's important for you and your process to have 3 or more vendors in it, I'm happy to respond. But if that's the case, I want you to know I'm going to do minimum viable information such that you can validly compare. I know this sounds a bit weird, but I don't know. What's your reaction to that, Greg? And the reason I did that is because I want them to know I care about them, so that the next time there's a new business problem, they will come ask me early and say, do you guys have anything? And I'll get another shot at the title.
Yeah, that's a very Matt Cameron approach, nuanced and next level. I like it. I'm going to steal that like I do a lot of stuff from you, Matt. But I think it's good. I mean, sometimes you just know there's no way, right? This is dead meat. I can see it, right? And so, I've passed before, but I see your point, right? You're going to become column fodder, right? You know it. But you do the minimal viable. And if you have the capacity in your organization, and if you're responding to 5 other things, and your bid team is just, and your deal desk is completely tied up, I just passed. But if you have the capacity to do it, or you want to do it yourself, and build a relationship by saying, look, I'll give you another alternative to look at, but it's not going to be, our finest work here. You can go ahead and do that. I think it's a good idea, but it's a shame when it's already, it's already decided, right? Because procurement's role in the process is to create a level playing field and to make sure the suppliers all have a shot, right? A fair shot at the business, and to gather a fact base, right? An objective fact base from which the stakeholders can make a smart decision, a data-driven decision. And, but it does happen, right? There is influence on those RFPs. I admitted to it myself a long time ago. I did it, right? Because I had a client who said, I don't want to switch, but I have to do an RFP. And I said, we'll write it for you. So we had a few other people pass on that one, a few of our competitors. And, but I like your technique. If you have the time and capacity to do it, and you think it'll end up, you're playing a long game there, right? And, and going to win later. But I think that's a good way to build that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's not for everyone, but for me, I'm like, I don't want to make his or her job harder, because if I don't respond and 3 others don't respond, then they're scrambling to fill the table, right? Which is a bit of a challenge. The deal I'm proudest of winning was a telco where it was loaded from the start, and so my bluff was I declined to bid and called out their process. I said, I'm not bidding because I think the dice are loaded, and literally put that in a formal document, which then instigated a phone call from the chief operating officer of a telco. So think you get a phone call from the assistant of AT&T's COO. That was intimidating for a young man, yes. I can tell you. But we won that deal because the only way for him to say there's credibility in the process was to answer my questions about why would you pick us? So now I have access to a CXO that nobody else has access to, who's telling me why we should win. And we did. So
that's great.
It was crazy.
No, I think if you don't like the game, you have to try to change the game, right? If you think it's stacked against you, right? But I think those are hopefully exceptional cases, right? Because I think generally speaking, it does come out as a more fair process. Hopefully, that's what you're seeing out there.
100%, yeah. And I think these sorts of things with the loaded dice around the RFPs really happen at the lower end of town, where it's a less strategic decision. It's a more of a tactical thing, from my experience anyway, for sure. So, Greg, we've come up for where I think time should be for us. I don't have any more inbound questions right now, but I'll tell you what, for me, insight packed, right? So I hope everybody on this call and anybody who sees this shares our discussion widely, because I think there's so much disillusion in dealing with procurement, a misunderstanding of the function. And I'm going to come back to that comment about marketing and ABM. Why are category managers not included in account-based marketing programs? That's nuts to me. Yeah. But Greg, thank you so much for your time. You're an absolute gem. And I know there's what's the name of that conference coming up? A strategic sourcing procurement conference?
It's the Sourcing Industry Group. It's their spring summit coming up, and that's May, I think, 4th, 5th, and 6th. So we've got
fantastic. So for those of you who are procurement professionals working inside your organization, you should probably make sure you get there. Salespeople, don't try and sneak in there. That's not for you. But so for now, again, Greg, thank you very much. Really valuable, and I look forward to our next chat.
All right, Matt. Thanks for having me. Have a great day. Take care.